The first light of dawn crawled across a wasteland of mud and silence. Frost clung to broken helmets. Smoke still drifted in the low mist that hugged the earth like breath on glass. Somewhere in that fog a man stirred. British, 23, his uniform stiff with ice, his hands trembling around an empty rifle. He could hear boots crunching through the frost, not far, heavy, methodical. The sound of men he'd been trying to kill only hours ago. He looked up, his eyes hollow and red, and there they were. German soldiers moving carefully through the same frozen trench line. Just as starved, just as cold, just as human. No one raised a gun. There was no fight left to give. The world had shrunk to survival. One breath, one shiver, one heartbeat. The young Brit glanced at his last cartridge, a single round rattling in his hand. The German nearest him hesitated, watching. Then, slowly, impossibly, the enemy reached into his coat and tossed something across the mud. A small pouch and ammunition. Their eyes met. No words. Just the quiet understanding of men trapped in the same grave. A moment later, the Brit did the same, handing over a half-empty water flask. For the first time in days, both sides laughed softly, like men remembering how. Around them, others noticed. Cautious faces peering through smoke and frost, rifles lowering, exhaustion outweighing hate. Dawn was breaking over the Ardennes, and for one fleeting hour, before command would ever know, soldiers from both armies shared what little they had. Bullets, bread, and the fragile miracle of mercy. The winter of 1944 had teeth. It gnawed at bone, bit through wool, and turned every breath into ice. The Ardennes forest, once a place of quiet beauty, of pines whispering to the wind, had become a white hell, a labyrinth of snow-choked trails and shattered trees where death hid behind every drift. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted with fury only weeks before, and now in January, what was left were fragments, men scattered like debris after a storm. Along one stretch of the line, near Foy, Bastogne, and the forgotten hamlet of Bois-Jacques, the 101st Airborne and their German counterparts had fought each other into exhaustion. The front had frozen, literally and figuratively. There was no advance, no retreat, only waiting. Waiting and freezing. And in that endless cold, the silence after the guns was louder than any bombardment. Corporal William Billy Harker, 2nd Battalion, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, hadn't slept in days. His trench was little more than a coffin carved into the ice. He sat hunched over, coat stiff as bark, fingers cracked and raw from the cold. Around him, the forest was a graveyard of splintered trees. Shell holes brimmed with frozen water, the sky heavy and low, pressed on everything. The only movement came from the distant shimmer of smoke, the German lines just 200 yards away. He knew they were there. He could smell them even. That strange mix of gun oil, cigarettes, and humanity that all soldiers shared. Sometimes at night he could hear them talking. Faint voices in a language he didn't understand, yet somehow familiar in tone. Fear sounded the same in any tongue. The day before, the Americans had tried to move up, only to be driven back by mortars. The snow had swallowed the blood almost immediately, leaving pink stains that faded by sunset. Harker had dragged 2 wounded men back to the line, both barely conscious. One of them, Private Dugan, had whispered through blue lips, "It's too damn cold to die," and then stopped breathing before they reached the trench. They'd buried him shallowly, the ground too frozen for proper graves. Harker had said a prayer out of habit, though faith was a fragile thing here. In this war, God seemed to have gone silent too. Across the no-man's land, the Germans were in no better shape. Sergeant Erich Vollmer, 26th Volksgrenadier Division, sat in his dugout reading a letter from his sister in Cologne. The paper was smudged, torn at the edges, but he read it over and over anyway. She wrote about the bombings, the hunger, the fear, but also about a single candle they still lit every night. So you'll find your way home. He smiled bitterly at that. Home. That word meant nothing out here. His squad had been reduced to 7 men. Their machine gun was frozen solid and their ammunition was low. The company ahead had tried to retreat 2 days earlier, but command sent them back with pistols drawn. They had orders to hold no matter what, but orders didn't warm fingers or feed stomachs. His men were starving. One of them, Fritz Weber, had taken to melting snow for water in his helmet, while another used an old ration tin to catch falling flakes. They shared cigarettes, huddling together like wolves, and wondered how many more nights they could survive. When darkness fell, the front became a world of whispers and shadows. The snow reflected what little moonlight broke through, turning the dead forest into something ghostly and unreal. The occasional artillery shell screamed overhead, distant thunder rolling across the ridges, but otherwise, silence. Harker leaned against the trench wall, eyes half shut, listening to his heartbeat echo in his ears. Then faintly he heard something else, music. At first he thought he was imagining it. But no, there it was again. A harmonica, soft, hesitant, barely audible over the wind. Someone on the German side was playing. The notes drifted through the cold, fragile as breath. The tune was unfamiliar but haunting, and for a brief, impossible moment Harker forgot where he was. Around him other men lifted their heads, eyes narrowing. "You hear that?" one whispered. "Yeah," another said. "Crazy bastards," but no one fired. They just listened. And when the song ended, no one spoke for a long time. The next morning broke gray and merciless. The sky pressed low, the air so cold it made metal scream. The men on both sides moved mechanically, breaking ice from rifles, scraping frost from boots. Breakfast was a few frozen biscuits and the last of the coffee rations. Black, bitter, lukewarm. Around noon, Harker was checking his ammo pouch when he realized he was nearly dry. He cursed under his breath, slamming the pouch shut. The supply lines had been cut for days. Resupply was a rumor. The men had been told to make every bullet count, as if words could refill magazines. But as he stared at the empty bandolier, something inside him broke, not with anger, but with weariness. Across the frozen clearing he saw movement, a shadow shifting behind a shattered oak, German uniform unmistakable. Instinct made him grab his rifle. But then the figure stumbled, fell, and didn't move. Harker waited. 5 seconds. 10. The man didn't rise. Slowly, cautiously, Harker lifted his head above the trench. The German was crawling, dragging himself through the snow unarmed. For reasons he couldn't explain, Harker climbed out of the trench. "Christ, Billy, what the hell are you doing?" Lipton hissed, grabbing at his coat. Harker pulled free. "Just watch my back." The snow came up to his knees. His boots crunched loudly in the stillness. Every step felt like trespassing into something sacred. When he reached the German, he saw the man's face, pale, young, barely more than a boy. A bullet had grazed his arm. The blood had frozen black against his sleeve. The boy looked up, terrified. "Nicht schießen," he gasped. "Don't shoot." Harker lowered his weapon slowly. Then, without thinking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the last thing he had to offer, a single cigarette. He struck a match, shielding it from the wind, and handed it over. The German hesitated, then took it with shaking fingers. They shared it in silence, smoke curling between them, melting the frost from their lips. Behind them, both lines were watching. On the American side, rifles raised. On the German side, disbelief. No one moved. No one fired. When the cigarette burned down, the German pointed weakly to his rifle, lying yards away, and then to his ammunition pouch. Empty. Harker understood. He reached into his own, what a single clip left. He hesitated, then pulled it free, tossing it into the snow between them. The German stared, stunned, before nodding slowly, gratitude and confusion written across his face. Then, astonishingly, he reached into his coat and produced a small tin, biscuits, half stale but edible, and pushed them toward Harker. The trade was absurd, surreal, human. They both smiled faintly, like men remembering what peace might feel like. That was the moment it began. Small gestures, unspoken truces, tiny acts of defiance against the war itself. By midday, along that frozen stretch of the Ardennes, men who had spent weeks trying to kill one another were now waving, cautiously across the snow. A few tossed cigarettes, a few tossed tins of food. Someone, God knows who, threw over a handful of cartridges. Then another answered with coffee packets. Soon laughter echoed faintly across the no-man's land, disbelieving and raw. "They're trading with the damn Krauts," one American whispered, half amused, half horrified. "Yeah," another said, lighting a cigarette. Guess hell finally froze over. For hours it went on. Men stepping from trenches, hands raised, voices low. The frost glittered under the pale sun as uniforms mixed, shadows crossing enemy lines. They didn't speak the same language, but gestures were enough, pointing at empty bellies, miming cold, miming hunger, sharing what little warmth remained. A German sergeant handed over a small flask and an American passed back a pair of gloves. The exchange wasn't just things, it was acknowledgement. An unspoken agreement: we're all dying out here and maybe, just maybe, we don't have to hate each other while we do it. When dusk fell, both sides retreated quietly to their trenches. Command never knew. Or perhaps they did and pretended not to. The war rolled on, indifferent. But that night, for the first time in weeks, no shots were fired. Harker lay in his frozen trench, staring up at the stars that blinked faintly through the clouds. He thought about the boy he'd met, the cigarette, the look in his eyes, the strange peace that had passed between them. He felt something then he hadn't felt in months. Not hope, not forgiveness, just humanity, flickering like a candle in the wind. And though the world would keep burning come morning, for that one night in that one forgotten corner of the Ardennes, the war had paused long enough for men to remember they were still men. By dawn the next morning, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and relentless, blanketing the trenches in silence. The sky was a dull gray sheet, and for a few brief hours the Ardennes looked almost peaceful, like the war had finally burned itself out. But peace was an illusion, fragile as ice, and by the time the first courier reached the front carrying a stack of thin, crumpled papers from headquarters, that illusion was already breaking. The orders had come down. They weren't shouted or dramatized, just read aloud in the flat, practiced voice of a sergeant who looked as tired as the men listening. "Effective immediately," he said, his breath fogging in the air. "Fraternization with enemy personnel is strictly forbidden. Any exchange of goods, gestures, or communication will be considered treasonous behavior and punished accordingly." His voice carried down the line, through the snow, through the smoke, through the eyes of men who didn't need to be told what the words meant. The small moment of humanity that had flickered to life the day before was over, smothered by the cold machinery of command. Corporal Harker stood in his trench, the snow climbing higher around his boots, listening to the paper rustle as it was read. Behind him, Lipton spat into the snow. "They call it treason to share a damn cigarette," he muttered. "Guess decency's the enemy now." Harker didn't answer. He just stared across the white expanse where, 24 hours earlier, he'd stood face to face with the German boy. Fritz, he thought his name might have been. Somewhere beyond that fog, the enemy was hearing the same orders in another tongue, delivered by another weary voice. "Kein Kontakt mit dem Feind. Keine Kommunikation. Keine Gnade. No contact, no mercy." Vollmer, on the other side, listened to the same decree with his jaw clenched tight. He didn't look at his men as he folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. Weber said quietly, "But they're like us." Vollmer didn't respond. Orders were orders, and orders in this war were absolute. That morning the shooting began again. It started as a single crack, a sniper round slicing through the brittle air. The sound tore through the silence like glass shattering. Harker ducked instinctively. The bullet hit the trench wall inches from his head, throwing up a burst of snow. He felt anger rise before fear, anger that the brief truce had been erased so easily. A second shot came, then a third, and by noon the forest was alive again with fire. Machine guns chattered from the ridges, shells thumped in the distance, and men who had traded bread and bullets now killed one another again with precision. The snow turned black with smoke and red with blood. "Back to business," someone muttered bitterly. The strange peace that had held them together dissolved, replaced by the grinding rhythm of survival. Vollmer led his squad through the trees, crouching low beneath the skeletal pines. His breath came in short bursts. The snow muffled every sound except the crack of rifles. "Push left," he shouted, his voice hoarse. Weber stumbled beside him, his face pale, eyes darting between the trees. When they reached the clearing, the same one where yesterday's exchanges had taken place, Vollmer stopped. There, half buried in the snow, he saw it. The faint outline of boot prints crossing the no-man's land, and beside them, a cigarette butt still smoldering under a layer of frost. He stared at it for a long moment before moving on. Some part of him wanted to stop, to remember, but the machine of war was already grinding forward again, and he was just another cog. Back in the American line, Captain Winters arrived, his coat immaculate despite the mud, his expression unreadable. He carried the new orders folded neatly in his breast pocket. "I hear there were some exchanges yesterday," he said quietly to Harker. It wasn't a question. Harker met his gaze. "Just survival, sir. That's all it was." Winter studied him for a long time, then nodded slightly. "I understand, Corporal. But understand this, and the war doesn't care about survival. It cares about victory. And command doesn't tolerate sentimentality." He turned and walked on, leaving Harker with the bitter taste of shame that wasn't truly shame at all. It was the guilt of knowing he'd been human when the world demanded he be a soldier. That night, the bombardment began. The Germans opened up with everything they had: mortars, 88s, small arms fire. The ground shook under the assault, trees snapping like matchsticks. Harker and his men dove for cover as shells exploded overhead, showering them with dirt and snow. The air reeked of cordite and pine sap. He could hear men screaming through the chaos, calling for medics who couldn't reach them. Through the smoke, he caught glimpses of the enemy, silhouettes flashing between bursts of light, and his heart clenched as he realized one of them might be the boy from before. He fired anyway, blind, automatic, until the barrel of his rifle burned his hands. There was no time to think, no time to remember, only to shoot, reload, and pray the next shell didn't have his name on it. By midnight, the firing stopped. The forest was a scarred ruin, blackened trunks, craters glowing faintly with embers. The snow had turned to slush, streaked red and brown. The survivors crawled from their holes like ghosts. Harker's hand shook as he lit a cigarette with a trembling match. He took one drag, then looked down at the flame flickering between his fingers and thought of that moment. The cigarette shared across the snow. The absurdity of it, the beauty. He exhaled, watching the smoke twist into the cold night, and for the first time he felt something break inside him. Not fear, not anger, just the realization that the war had stolen something he could never get back. On the other side, Vollmer was doing the same. His unit was half gone. Weber was dead, hit by shrapnel, killed instantly. The boy's body lay under a thin sheet of snow. Vollmer knelt beside him, pulling the dog tags from his neck. His fingers brushed something else in the man's pocket, a folded scrap of paper. He opened it carefully. It was a drawing, crude, done in pencil, of a cigarette passed between two hands. He recognized it instantly. His throat tightened and he felt the tears before he could stop them. He folded the paper again, tucked it back into his coat, and stared into the trees. Somewhere out there, he thought, was the man who had shared that moment, and now they were enemies again. The next morning, command sent inspectors to the line. Officers from the rear, clean uniforms, clean hands, clean consciences. They asked questions, took notes, and warned of court-martials. "The enemy is to be treated as the enemy," one said sternly. "Any deviation from this will be punished." Harker kept his mouth shut. He said what they wanted to hear. But when night came and the officers left, he sat in the trench staring out into the snow, listening. And then he heard it, faint, barely there, and a single whistle, a melody carried on the wind. The same harmonica tune as before. He froze. For a long moment he thought he was dreaming. Then he took a breath, and against every order, against every law of war, he whistled it back. A response. A recognition. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then from the other side, the harmonica answered. A few slow, mournful notes. The men nearby stirred, glancing up from their rifles. No one said a word. No one stopped it. The sound drifted over the snow, fragile, defiant, beautiful. It was the sound of men remembering something command could never order away. In that frozen night, beneath a sky that looked too vast for so much cruelty, the melody rose and fell like a prayer. It was not peace. It was not surrender. It was something far rarer, an act of quiet rebellion against the madness of war. When it ended, the silence returned. But it was different now. The men who heard it carried that sound inside them, a small warmth against the endless cold. By morning, fresh snow had covered everything again. The bodies, the craters, the evidence. Only the faint footprints crossing the no-man's land remained, half buried, half forgotten. The war rolled on. Orders would come and go, officers would rise and fall, but for those who had been there, who had shared that impossible dawn, nothing would ever be the same. Because they had seen the truth, that even in the darkest winter of war, humanity could survive for a moment, fragile and fleeting, like a breath in the cold. The forest never forgot. Every echo, every scream, every bullet fired into its cold ribs stayed there, trapped between the pines like ghosts that refused to leave. By mid-January 1945, the Ardennes had become a graveyard in all but name. the snow concealing what the earth could no longer bear to hold. Beneath every drift were men, both German and American, locked forever in the contorted poses of battle. Helmets half buried, fingers frozen around rifles that would never fire again, and through it all the survivors moved like shadows, weary, starved, eyes hollow from too many nights without sleep. The 101st Airborne Division, dug in near Bois-Jacques, held their line by instinct now, more animal than soldier. The air was a metallic gray, heavy with the smell of burned powder and decay, and every step crunched with the brittle sound of snow over death. The living trudged above the fallen as though walking through the memory of a nightmare that refused to end. Corporal Billy Harker no longer counted days. There was no sense of time left, only the rhythm of cold mornings, quiet afternoons punctuated by gunfire, and long nights listening to the forest whisper. He had stopped writing letters weeks ago. What could he say? That the war had turned into an endless freeze where even the concept of warmth felt imaginary? That he couldn't remember the sound of silence without the echo of artillery behind it? He carried a small notebook still, but the pages were mostly filled with sketches. The curve of a tree shattered by shells, the outlines of helmets half hidden in snow, the faint memory of a German boy's face smiling through frost. He didn't know why he drew it, only that it helped. A small act of defiance against forgetting. The days had blurred into one another until one morning. Just before dawn, Harker's squad was ordered forward, a reconnaissance sweep to confirm German withdrawal reports. Winters himself had come down the line, his breath fogging, his tone quiet but firm. The Krauts are pulling back. Intel says they're regrouping west of the Auerthy. We need eyes on that ridge. Harker, take 4 men, keep low. Don't engage unless you have to. Harker nodded, though his stomach clenched. The last time someone had said don't engage, half the patrol hadn't returned. Still, orders were orders, and at least it was movement, something to break the monotony of waiting for death. They moved out just before sunrise. The snow was thick enough to swallow sound, their boots sinking silently as they threaded between the skeletal trees. The forest was eerie in the half-light, mist curling around branches like smoke, silence so deep it felt sacred. Every so often they passed a frozen body, German or American, indistinguishable now except for the insignia on the sleeves. The frost made them all equal in the end. One of the men, Parker, muttered under his breath, "Feels like walking through the afterlife." Harker didn't answer. He just nodded once, keeping his rifle ready. After 2 hours of moving through white emptiness, they reached the ridge. From there, they could see across a shallow valley, a clearing littered with wrecked vehicles and burned-out supply sleds. Beyond that, smoke rose faintly from a cluster of trees and maybe 2 miles away. "That's them," Parker whispered, pulling back like command said. But Harker frowned. The smoke wasn't moving like a column or convoy. It was steady, small, too localized. "No," he said quietly. "That's a campfire." They crept closer, down into the valley, the air colder now, the snow crunching softly underfoot. As they neared the edge of the clearing, the wind shifted, and with it came sound. Faint, rhythmic human voices, but not shouting, singing. The men froze. Harker signaled them down, sliding onto his stomach behind a fallen log. Through the frost-laced branches, he saw them. German soldiers, and maybe a dozen, huddled around a small fire, their rifles stacked in a pyramid beside them. They were singing softly, a hymn by the sound of it, their voices low and mournful, rising into the pale morning air like incense. For a long moment, the Americans just watched. The Germans looked too tired to be a threat, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow, movements slow. One of them was tending to another's wound, wrapping a torn sleeve around a bleeding arm. Another poured hot water from a dented kettle into tin cups. It didn't look like an army anymore. It looked like survivors, Parker whispered. "We could take them." Harker's jaw tightened. He knew he was right. They had the drop. They could kill them all before they even reached for their rifles. But he didn't move. Something inside him resisted. He remembered the harmonica, the cigarette, the moment when killing had seemed impossible. "No," he said finally. "We leave them." Parker stared at him. "Orders were to observe," Harker snapped softly. "Not to slaughter." He didn't take his eyes off the Germans. For a moment, one of them, tall, thin, with a scarf wrapped around his face, looked up as if sensing them. Their eyes met across the snow. Harker froze. It was him, Vollmer. The recognition was instant, instinctual. He didn't know how he knew, but he did. The way the man held himself, the weariness in his posture. And in that instant, across the white expanse of death, two soldiers saw each other not as enemies but as survivors of the same hell. Harker lowered his rifle. Vollmer didn't move. Neither spoke. Then the German raised his hand, slow, deliberate, and pointed east into the forest. Minen, he mouthed silently. Mines. Harker blinked, understanding dawning. The valley ahead, the one command wanted them to scout, was mined. If they'd gone further, they'd have been blown apart. Vollmer was warning him. Harker nodded once, the smallest gesture of thanks. Then, as quietly as they had come, he signaled his men to pull back. Parker gave him a look, confusion, disbelief, but obeyed. They slipped back into the trees, leaving the Germans to their fire. When they reached the ridge again, Harker looked back one last time. The campfire still burned, faint and orange in the pale dawn, and around it, the men continued to sing. He couldn't make out the words, but the melody stuck in his head, winding through the branches long after the sound had faded. By the time they returned to base, the snow had started again, thick, heavy flakes falling in silence. Winters listened to the report with a furrowed brow. "You're certain about the mines?" he asked. Harker nodded. "Yes, sir. Whole valley's covered. Would have walked right into it." Winters scribbled a note, then paused. "How do you know?" Harker hesitated. He thought about lying, but something in Winters' face and that quiet understanding he'd seen before made him speak. "A German told me," he said simply. Winters looked up sharply. "A German?" "Yes, sir, warned us. Saved our lives." The room went still. No one spoke. Finally, Winters exhaled, slow. "You realize that's not a detail I can put in the report?" Harker nodded. "I know, sir." Winters met his eyes. "Then we'll just say you spotted them yourself." He closed the notebook and walked away. Harker stood there for a moment, unsure whether to feel grateful or ashamed. That night, the temperature dropped below 20. The men huddled together in their foxholes, trying to keep warm with body heat and whatever scraps of blankets they had left. Somewhere out in the dark, wolves howled. The forest groaned in the wind. Harker lay awake, staring at the frost forming on his rifle barrel, and thought about the Germans by the fire. He wondered if they were still alive, if the song was still echoing through the trees. He thought about Vollmer, the man who'd chosen mercy in a war that punished it, and felt a strange kind of kinship, the sort that didn't need words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his notebook, flipping to a blank page. With numb fingers, he began to sketch again. A small fire, men huddled close, a warning hand pointing east. Beneath it, he wrote only 2 words. He warned us. 3 days later, command advanced. The snow had melted just enough for the tanks to move, and the 101st pushed forward through the valley that had nearly become their grave. The engineers confirmed it, anti-personnel mines buried in neat, deadly rows. The ridge where Harker had met Vollmer was now a staging area for artillery, and by afternoon, the air was filled with the thunder of shells once more. The forest shook, the earth split, and whatever traces remained of that fragile humanity were buried under the weight of the war's return. Yet even as the front shifted, even as bodies were buried and names erased, the story of that patrol began to spread quietly among the men. Whispers over cigarettes, murmurs in mess lines. "They say a Kraut saved Harker's squad," someone would say. "Told them about the mines." No one knew if it was true, but it didn't matter. The story took on a life of its own. A flicker of light carried from trench to trench, camp to camp, a reminder that somewhere beneath the machinery of death, there was still something human left, and far to the east across the lines. Vollmer survived too, barely. His unit was shattered at Hufelies, and he was pulled from the front with frostbite and shrapnel wounds. He spent the rest of the war in a field hospital outside Cologne, where nurses whispered that he sometimes woke in the night calling out in English. One of them, curious, asked him once, "Who are you calling for?" He just smiled faintly and said, "No one. Just a friend." By February 1945, the snow had begun to thaw, turning the Ardennes into a gray sea of mud and ash. The thaw exposed everything the winter had hidden. The bodies, the wreckage, the shattered helmets jutting from the ground like tombstones. Crows circled overhead, their cries harsh and mocking, as if reminding the living of what they'd done to earn their survival. The 101st had moved east, pushing toward Luxembourg, their boots sinking in black slush that stank of oil and death. The men were thinner now, eyes sunken, faces carved by cold and exhaustion. Even their laughter and what little remained would have sounded brittle, hollow. They'd won, or so the papers said, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like endurance. The kind of endurance that stripped away everything but the core of what made a man human. And for Corporal Billy Harker, that core was starting to crack. He hadn't spoken much since the patrol. The image of the German warning him about the mines haunted his sleep, not as a nightmare, but as a question he couldn't answer. Why would an enemy save him? What did that mean for everything he'd been told to believe? The army had trained him to see the world in black and white, friend and foe, victory and defeat, right and wrong. But now all he saw were shades of gray blending into the mud beneath his boots. War had a way of simplifying everything until nothing made sense. And as they marched past burned villages and abandoned farms, Harker felt the weight of the dead pressing closer, whispering through the trees. The column halted near a ruined crossroads just outside Wiltz, where a handful of stone houses still stood amid the wreckage. The air smelled faintly of wet straw and cordite. Harker's unit took shelter in what had once been a farmhouse, the roof half gone, the walls scorched. Inside they found signs of life, a wooden table, a child's toy, a photograph nailed crookedly to the wall. It showed a family, a man, woman, and 2 children, smiling awkwardly for the camera. The father's uniform was Wehrmacht gray. Parker stared at it for a long time, then tore it down. "They started this," he said flatly. Harker didn't reply. He just picked up the photograph from the floor, brushed off the soot, and slipped it into his pocket. Not out of sympathy, but because he couldn't stand the thought of it trampled under muddy boots. That night, as the wind howled through the broken roof, the men sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Someone passed around a bottle of schnapps scavenged from a cellar. It burned going down, warming the belly but not the soul. Harker took a sip, then stared into the dark corner of the room where moonlight spilled through a hole in the wall. He thought he saw movement there, just a flicker, and his hand went instinctively to his rifle. But it wasn't an enemy. It was a child. A girl, maybe 8 years old, clutching a blanket and staring at them with wide, terrified eyes. She must have been hiding in the house the whole time. For a moment, no one moved. Then Harker slowly lowered his weapon and crouched down. "It's okay," he said softly. She didn't understand the words, but the tone made her relax just slightly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of hard biscuit. She hesitated, then took it. When she smiled, in small, hesitant, something inside him broke again, but this time it wasn't sorrow. It was recognition. The girl could have been his sister back home. She could have been anyone's. By morning, the unit moved on, leaving the girl with the locals who'd begun returning to the village. As they trudged through the thawing fields, Harker couldn't stop thinking about her. About all the children like her, born into a world already burning, forced to grow up under skies filled with steel. He wondered if somewhere Volmer had a family too. He wondered if the man had survived. He didn't know why it mattered, but it did. Because if Volmer was still alive, then maybe the world wasn't entirely lost. Maybe there was still something left to save. 2 days later, they reached Bitburg, a town reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. The air stank of smoke and brick dust. Civilians wandered the streets like ghosts, scavenging through ruins for anything edible. The soldiers passed them without speaking. War had made everyone numb to suffering. But that changed when they reached the square. There in the center stood a row of bodies hanging from lampposts. German soldiers, their uniforms stripped of insignia, signs around their necks reading "cowards" and "traitors." Local townspeople had done it. Revenge for betrayal, collaboration, or maybe nothing at all. The wind tugged at the corpses, making them sway gently. One of the men vomited. Another crossed himself. Harker just stared. Among the faces, one looked hauntingly familiar. Gaunt, pale, the eyes frozen half open in an expression of disbelief. For a second, his heart stopped. But no, it wasn't Volmer. The hair was too dark, the features too sharp. Still, the resemblance was enough to leave him shaking. That night, Harker sat outside the ruins of a church, staring at the steeple that had been sheared in half by a shell. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the broken roof, landing on the cracked marble altar. He took out his notebook again and turned to the page where he'd drawn Volmer by the fire. Beneath it, he wrote one new word: why. He didn't know who he was asking, God, fate, or the war itself, but the question burned in his chest like a wound that wouldn't close. Around him, the wind whispered through the ruins, carrying the faint echo of church bells long gone silent. The following morning, orders came down for a final push toward the Rhine. The war was nearing its end, though no one dared to believe it. Rumors spread through the ranks: Hitler retreating to Berlin, the Russians closing in, whole German divisions surrendering. But on the ground, none of it mattered. The men still had to march, still had to fight, still had to survive one more day. Harker's squad was tasked with securing a bridge outside Remagen, part of a series of crossings the Allies hoped to capture intact. As they approached, the sound of distant gunfire rolled through the fog, not heavy, just sporadic, like the last gasps of a dying beast. When they reached the riverbank, the bridge loomed out of the mist, half collapsed. The far span twisted, cables hanging like dead vines. On the near side, a group of German soldiers stood waving white cloths. Surrender. The men raised their rifles uncertainly. Parker muttered, "Could be a trick." Harker didn't answer. He stepped forward, rifle lowered, eyes fixed on the Germans. They were young, too young, barely out of school, faces gaunt, uniforms patched and threadbare. One of them stepped forward, trembling, his hands raised high. "Nicht schießen. Bitte, don't shoot." The Americans advanced cautiously. When they reached the group, Harker noticed something. One of the Germans wore a scarf wrapped around his neck, gray and frayed. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that single piece of cloth. He froze. Slowly, the man lowered his hands and looked up. Their eyes met. Vollmer. The recognition hit them both at once. Disbelief, shock, and something like relief all tangled together. The war around them seemed to fade to silence. Harker lowered his rifle. Vollmer smiled faintly, the expression weary, almost tender. "You made it," he said in broken English. Harker nodded, unable to speak. Then without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the notebook, the one with the drawing of the campfire, and held it up. Vollmer's eyes widened, then softened. He reached into his own coat and pulled something out, a folded scrap of paper, creased and stained. The same drawing. Harker laughed, a raw, breathless sound that startled his men. Vollmer laughed too, and for that one impossible moment, surrounded by ruins and surrender, two soldiers stood face to face as something far greater than enemies. Then the shout came. "Hold it!" Officers from the rear stormed in, pistols drawn. "What the hell is this?" One of them, a captain from headquarters, grabbed Harker by the collar. "You fraternizing with the enemy again, Corporal?" he barked. Harker didn't answer. He just stared at Vollmer, who stood perfectly still, hands raised once more. The captain turned his pistol toward the German. "We don't take prisoners here." Harker's blood went cold. "No," he shouted, stepping between them. "He surrendered. He saved us back in the Ardennes," the captain sneered. "You're out of line, soldier." His finger tightened on the trigger. Harker didn't think, and he moved. He grabbed the barrel, shoving it aside just as the shot went off. The round tore into the ground. The captain staggered, furious. "You're done, Corporal. You hear me? Done!" In the chaos, Vollmer's men dropped their weapons, hands trembling. The standoff lasted only seconds before higher command intervened. A major shouting orders, MPs rushing in. Vollmer and his group were taken as prisoners. Harker was pulled aside, his ears ringing, his heart pounding. The captain spat in the snow, muttering about soft-hearted fools before storming off. Winters found Harker an hour later, sitting by the river staring at the water that shimmered with oil and ash. "You did the right thing," Winters said quietly. Harker shook his head. "Feels like there's no right left, sir. Just less wrong." Winters put a hand on his shoulder. "That's enough sometimes." That night, as the 101st bivouacked near the river, Harker found himself staring across the camp toward the makeshift POW enclosure. Inside, behind barbed wire, Vollmer sat by a small fire, hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. For a long moment, their eyes met again. Vollmer lifted the cup in a silent toast. Harker nodded. Then he turned away, the wind carrying the faint sound of the river. Soft, endless, and indifferent. The war would end soon. The papers would call it victory. Medals would be handed out, speeches made. But for Harker, And for the countless others who had walked through the frozen woods of the Ardennes, victory was a hollow word. The real reckoning wasn't with the enemy, it was with themselves, with the ghosts they'd carry long after the shooting stopped. In the years to come, he would tell no stories, write no memoirs. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the world was quiet, he'd hear it again, that harmonica tune drifting through the dark, and remember the man who shared his cigarette, who warned him of mines, who laughed with him at the edge of surrender, the man who, for a brief moment in hell, proved that even the dead of the forest hadn't taken everything. Not yet. The war didn't end with fanfare or banners for the men who lived it. It ended with silence. A silence so deep and sudden it felt wrong, as though the world had stopped breathing. By the time the German surrender came in May 1945, the 101st Airborne had pushed through a landscape that barely resembled Europe anymore. Towns flattened to dust, rivers choked with debris, forests stripped bare by shell fire. The men didn't cheer when the news came down. They just sat where they were, staring at one another with blank eyes as if waiting for the next shell that never came. Harker was among them, sitting on the back of a truck near Berchtesgaden, the distant Bavarian peaks glowing in the weak spring sun. He should have felt something, relief, joy, even grief, but all he felt was the numb ache of exhaustion. Around him, men smoked in silence, each drag a fragile ritual. The air smelled of cigarettes and melting snow, and somewhere down the road a band was playing a tune that no one listened to. The war was over, they said, but to Harker it didn't feel over. It just felt suspended, like a pause between breaths, waiting for something to start again. The prisoners came through the next day. Columns of them marching slow and broken under the watch of MPs. Germans mostly, boys and old men, uniforms tattered, boots falling apart. Some limped. Some stared straight ahead. Others looked at the ground as if ashamed to meet the gaze of the men who had beaten them. Harker stood by the roadside watching them pass. And then, among the hollow faces, he saw him. Volmer. The same scarf, the same quiet bearing, though now he looked older, decades older. Their eyes met, and for a moment the noise of the column, the barking of guards, the rumble of trucks all faded away. Harker didn't move. He didn't salute, didn't wave. He just watched. And Volmer, with the faintest hint of a smile, nodded once before disappearing into the sea of prisoners. That was the last time Harker ever saw him. 2 weeks later, the division was pulled back to France for demobilization. The men joked half-heartedly about going home, but there was a hollowness in their laughter. Home felt like another country now, a place that existed only in letters and memories. Harker spent his last nights in a tent near Reims, where the fields were turning green again. The snow was gone, the air smelled of wet grass, and for the first time in months birds sang in the trees. It should have felt like peace, but it didn't. Peace was too big a word for what they'd earned. What they had now was something smaller, quieter, survival. And even that felt fragile. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Harker wandered away from camp. He walked until he reached the edge of a meadow, where the ruins of a farmhouse stood half-collapsed under the weight of ivy and thyme. There was a fence there, and beyond it a row of poplars swaying in the wind. He sat on the fence post, lit a cigarette, and stared at the fading light. The smoke curled upward, gray and soft, catching the last rays of the sun. He thought of Volmer again, of that night in the snow, the harmonica, the warning, the bridge, the salute by the fire. Every memory came back sharp and alive, each one a fragment of something too fragile to last. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his notebook. The pages were smudged, the edges worn from rain and dirt, but the drawings were still there. The cigarette exchange, the campfire, the bridge. At the very back, on the last page, he began to draw again. This time it was just two figures, one American, one German, sitting side by side on a fence, sharing a cigarette under an open sky. Beneath it, he wrote 3 words: "We survived together." When he looked up again, the sun was gone. The sky was deep blue, the first stars flickering to life. He flicked the cigarette away, watched the ember die in the grass, and whispered something he hadn't said in months. "Thank you." He didn't know who he was saying it to. Maybe to Volmer, maybe to the nameless dead, maybe to the version of himself that had made it through. Then he stood, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and began the slow walk back to camp. Back in the tent, the others were packing. Orders had come. Transport to Le Havre, then ships home. Harker rolled his gear quietly, tucking the notebook into his rucksack. Parker glanced at him. "You ready to go home?" he asked. Harker looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I'm not sure home's still there," he said softly. Parker nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Me neither." The next morning, they boarded the trucks that would take them west. The road wound through fields now bright with spring flowers, but the ground was still pitted with shell holes and rusted helmets. Every few miles, they passed the remnants of the war. Burned-out tanks, broken wagons, graves marked by makeshift crosses. The landscape was healing, but the scars would never vanish. As they crossed into France, a convoy of German POWs trudged past in the opposite direction. Harker's eyes searched the faces automatically, though he knew it was pointless. Vollmer could be anywhere. A name on a list, a body in a ditch, a man rebuilding a life somewhere far away. But as the trucks rumbled past, he caught a fleeting sound that made his breath hitch. A harmonica. Faint, almost drowned by the engine noise, but unmistakable. The same tune as before. He turned, leaning out of the truck, scanning the column until he saw him. Just a glimpse. A figure in a tattered coat walking among the prisoners, harmonica pressed to his lips. Vollmer. The melody drifted through the morning air. Clear, defiant, heartbreakingly human. Harker raised a hand. Vollmer saw him, smiled faintly, and kept playing until the convoy disappeared into the distance. The sound lingered long after the music was gone, fading into the hum of the tires into memory. By the time they reached the port, the war felt like something that had happened to someone else. The ships were lined up in the harbor, gray hulks against the blue water. Men queued quietly, each clutching duffel bags and papers stamped with the word homeward. Some laughed, some cried, some just stared at the sea. When Harker reached the gangway, he paused and looked back. The wind was cold off the channel, carrying the smell of salt and diesel. Behind him, Europe stretched out, a continent shattered, stitched together with graves. He thought of the men who wouldn't be going home, of the ones buried under snow or ash, of Vollmer walking somewhere beyond the wire, playing that tune into the endless wind. Then he turned, stepped onto the deck, and walked toward whatever waited beyond the horizon. Years passed. The war faded into stories, into grainy newsreels, into the silence of veterans who spoke of it only when drunk or dreaming. Harker built a life in the States, a small house, a wife, a son who grew up never knowing what the war smelled like. But on winter nights, when the wind howled through the eaves, Harker would take out an old harmonica he'd found in a Paris market and play that same tune. Soft, slow, imperfect. His son once asked him where he'd learned it. Harker smiled and said, "From a friend I met a long time ago." He never explained further. Some memories were too fragile to name. When he died, decades later, his son found the notebook among his belongings, its pages yellowed, the drawings faint but still visible. On the last page, beneath the sketch of the two soldiers on the fence, the ink had faded to a pale gray. But the words were still legible. "We survived together." The harmonica lay beside it, its metal dull with age. The son placed both items in a small box and kept them by his bedside. Sometimes, on quiet nights, he'd open it and imagine the two men, one American, one German, sitting under a frozen sky, sharing a cigarette while the world burned around them. And for a moment, he could almost hear the music again, faint, fragile, but eternal. Because that was the truth of it. Wars end, nations rise and fall, memories fade. But humanity, that small, stubborn spark, endures. It survives in acts so small they seem meaningless. A shared cigarette, a warning whispered across the snow, a melody played in the ruins. These were the moments that defied history, that outlasted the noise of guns. When historians wrote their books and politicians gave their speeches, they wouldn't mention men like Billy Harker or Hans Vollmer. But the forest remembered. The snow remembered. The silence of the Ardennes still held the echo of their breath, their laughter, their song. And in that silence, in that impossible moment when enemies became brothers, the war,